Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
In this lecture, we are going to look at science in ancient India, and we should know that India is one of the major world civilizations, and the hallmark of a civilization is acquiring script for languages and a degree of urbanization and economic surplus. I think the Indian society achieved this a long time ago, and that's why Indian civilization could contribute to knowledge in various fields. Before we start discussion on science in India, I would like to mention that science should be seen in its historical integrity. It means that we have to relate knowledge generated at a given point in time should be seen in relation to that period and persons and their peers and students or organizations that were involved in generating knowledge. That means we have to relate knowledge generated at a given point in time in history of every society to that period. In the sense, we have to see in relation to that context, and we cannot compare yesterday's science with today's science. It means that we cannot, for example, compare Aristotle's science with today's science. Similarly, we cannot compare knowledge generated about the world in ancient India with the knowledge generated today about the world. So I think this is very important to keep in mind, so that we can look at the contributions in their own context. In this lecture, I draw upon the following work. B.V. Subbarayappa and D.M. Bose edited Concise History of Science in India. Actually, S.N. Sen also contributed several articles to this book. He is also one of the editors. I should acknowledge that. So if you look at the kind of contributions that were made in ancient India, there are several sources that one should depend on and see what they have done, what kind of knowledge they generated, and about what kind of domain they generated knowledge. This is an important task that one should do. In this lecture, I am only going to draw upon these sources and briefly mention what they have contributed, what they have done in advancing knowledge. So in going into details will take a lot of time, which I would like to, and this lecture is not going to give that kind of time. Okay, the corpus of knowledge about nature and society in ancient India can be found in the Vedas, the related Brahmanas, texts and the Upanishads, and later Sutras and Bhashyas. So I think there is a continuous link between the Vedas and later texts. One can see Indian context. The Vedic literature was produced over time between 600 BC and 200 BC. The Brahmana literature produced between 600 BC and 800 BC, and Upanishads between 800 BC and 1000 BC, again from the same book which I just now mentioned. The four Vedas, Rig Veda, Samaveda, Yajurveda and Atharvana Veda, deal with several subjects: religious practices, ideas about nature, and so on. If you look at the relations between these texts and the kind of flow that was there from Vedas onwards, you see the Vedas were called Shrutis because they are supposed to be revealed knowledge. The Shrutis are Rig Veda, Samaveda, Yajurveda and Atharvana Veda, developed during 600 BC to 200 BC. Then Samhitas or Vedas and led to Brahmana texts 600 to 800 BC, and Aranyakas or Upanishads, the texts which are supposed to be summaries of the Vedas, with 800 BC to 1000 BC. Vedangas, Sutras, phonetics. Siksha means related to phonetics, ritual, Kalpa, etymology, Nirukta, and metrics, Chandas, astronomy, Jyotisha, beginnings of scientific knowledge. These Sutra Vedangas represent more deeper knowledge about the various domains, and Bhashya are the texts of elucidation of Vedangas and Sutras. For example, Patanjali Mahabhashya, Vatsyayana, Bharata's Natya Shastra and Shankaracharya's contributions to this Bhashya literature are very, very important in this. Knowledge about nature, for example, the Atharvana Veda recognized 55, 77, 99 diseases and also recognized that worms cause diseases. One can see the parallels between this kind of a number and the German incantations, which also indicated they recognize 77 and 99 diseases, similar number of diseases they recognized. The idea of Tridhatu or Tridosha, this Vata, Pitta, Kapha, was formulated. A human being is healthy if the three dhatus are in balance. Imbalance causes disorders and diseases. Sutras necessitated bhashyas and they also paved way for development of sloka style of composition present in the Dharma Shastras, medical texts, mathematical and astronomical texts, encyclopedic works like Brihat Samhita and arts and sciences in general. The sloka type of composition could be seen in all kind of works. This is supposed to be very precise and very short kind of propositions or formulations which can be understood very well. Panini 350 BC celebrated Ashtadhyayi, rendered the work of all his predecessors obsolete and laid foundations for a new system of syntax and grammar. Written in about, it deals with technical terms, nouns in compositions, case relations, rules for adding suffixes to the roots, etc. Patanjali's Mahabhashya is a commentary on Panini's work. Orthodox philosophical systems, India also produced several systems of philosophy, each one of them had a different kind of focus and different kind of methodology, and the orthodox systems are as follows: Purva Mimamsa, Uttar Mimamsa. Mimamsa means investigation. We deal with the notions of sound and its propagation. Samkhya philosophy deals with enumeration, categorization and classification in hierarchical system. Yoga deals with practical aspects, principles and practices to promote a healthy body and control and cure of many pathological conditions. The Sankhya system is supposed to have originated outside the Vedic literature in regions where Buddhism was about to take roots. So we also have, along with this Vedic literature, we also have other kind of contributions coming up in India during this time. There is another system called Nyaya, which means method or logic or reasoning. Vaiseshika also deals with logic and rules of method, also used in during Buddhist period. So we already, ancient India contributed to very sophisticated ways of arguing, sophisticated way of building up propositions and sophisticated way of putting forward one's kind of a position on any matter. In the sense they also were aware of the method, the logic and or reasoning. They could, later on we see in modern science we talk of logic as reasoning as one of the methods, rationalist methods of knowledge, which René Descartes was supposed to, René Descartes really proposed that every human being is endowed with power of reason and one should subject all claims to the scrutiny of reason. This was recognized in our country much earlier, where Nyaya Vaiseshika's system also talks of logic or reasoning, that one should really put forward one's argument in a logical manner. One should recognize the contributions of this kind that were made in Indian civilization much earlier than Western civilization. Then another important text that we have about Indian situation is Kautilya's Arthashastra. That is, Kautilya is also known as Vishnugupta Chanakya. Arthashastra 300 to 321 BC, during this period it was written. It deals with the science of interests. It deals with practical aspects of life. For example, economics, administration, politics, arts and crafts and techniques, principles of taxation and other issues that are relevant to relations between the state and state agencies and the subjects or people at large. So Chanakya was an architect of establishing a kingdom, and also he was the advisor to Chandragupta's regime. In the sense, he was the one who laid foundations for the taxation system also elaborated on the rules rules for administration and so on. So I think it's very, very important to recognize that much earlier in our civilization, this kind of thinking was prevalent. People could understand what does it mean to run a state and its agencies, and what is the relationship between the state and the people at large, or state and its subjects, as it were. So these are very elaborate accounts that were given. What are the duties of the king towards people? What are the responsibilities or duties of the people towards the state, and so on. These were very elaborately done in this text, which is extremely, even now people keep quoting these texts to indicate that in India this kind of text was produced, and even now some of the thinking that went into this kind of work is relevant. And all the political science texts today, modern political science texts, and to some extent economic historians draw attention to what has been done by Kautilya in his work. Niti Shastra is based again on the authority of Kautilya's Arthashastra. Kamandaki 700 AD wrote Niti Shastra dealing with topics related to polity and system of rules and role of the ruler. In this sense, this is more of a text on the ethics of ruling that should be followed in the context of administration, in the context of the relationship between king and its subjects. So what does one mean by Niti Shastra? Means how should one really relate to, how should king relate to the people, and what should be the what are the ethical ways in which the administration has to be run and the country had to be ruled. Then we enter the period of epics. Mahabharata, the epic composed by several people over centuries. The text of Mahabharata that is available was composed during 400 BC to 400 AD, almost very, very long time. Several people contributed to the development of this text. In this text, what we find is the matters of scientific interest in epic include information about gold, plants and animals, gold, plants and animals. Plants are recognized as living organisms with consciousness, and there is also a kind of classification of plants, animals and flowers. Now already we know that in ancient India people started classifying things, classification of animals and plants. See, classification is one of the important steps in understanding the world. So even now we use a system of classification of plants and animals, and that's extremely important to understand the animal world or the world of plants. So classification existed even during Mahabharata time, but of course the scope of the scope of this kind of classification was related to the kind of flora and fauna they had at the time, and flora and fauna that were used in their lives. The epic Ramayana, 200 BC to 200 AD, contains information regarding plants, trees, herbs and animals. In the sense, it is far more, perhaps it has contained more information about this. These texts also recognize the importance of classifying things. So classification, as I said, is an important way of categorizing objects, categorizing organisms, so that we understand them better and also see how they are related to each other. The Puranas, for example, there are a set of texts again. Agni Purana deals with plant life and has references to zero. I should mention that one of the most important contributions of Indian civilization to the humanity is the notion of zero. So the notion of zero really introduced into numerals really help us to enumerate several things into millions and trillions, right? One can count in terms of millions and trillions by if you have a zero. So that is one of the significant contributions which has been recognized, and it has become part of our knowledge today. Garuda Purana deals with pathological categories of 5 diseases and also deals with veterinary science. So, Garuda Purana is another text which has some ideas about, gives some ideas about diseases and also deals with the veterinary science that is relating to health of animals. Varahamihira's Brahat Samhita is 500 AD text, written 5 AD. He was a scholar of great repute who contributed to several branches of knowledge, language, astronomy, astrology, etc. Then another important system of knowledge that we developed is Ayurveda system, which is a science of health. Ayurveda is a theory and related therapeutics. Ayurveda subscribes to the Panchabhuta theory, that is earth, air, water, fire and akasha, space. The human health depends on the balance among the 3 dhatus, that is Vata, Pitta, Kapha, which are dependent in some sense on the exposure to these Panchabhutas. Imbalance among the 3 dhatus because of unwanted exposure to the 5 elements and substances occurring therein causes imbalance among the 3 dhatus. That is, even now Ayurveda system works, but unfortunately, as we are going to show during colonial time, the Ayurvedic medical practice was not supported by the British government, and colleges teaching or schools teaching Ayurvedic medicine was closed down. So, that is how Ayurveda lost its importance during colonial period. Again, we are trying to revive it. Ayurvedic medicine people still use, and people turn to Ayurveda for various kinds of diseases. It is a still living medical system. The therapy includes administering various kinds of preparations, bhasmas, very fine powder, churnas, solid in small size, lehyas, semi-solid pastes, semi-solid substances, medicines in semi-solid form, and rasayanas, liquids, and in some cases surgery. See, for example, even now we are familiar with these terms, bhasmas, churnas, lehyas and rasayanas. See, one of the important contributions of Ayurvedic medicine is in preparing bhasmas, a fine powder. People say they prepare these bhasma particles are sometimes nano-sized particles. For example, gold, which is one of the important, it is also used in Ayurvedic medicine, is powdered finely to the nano size and then administered to people. So, only at that size we can really take in gold particles. So, I think the idea of a bhasma or the fine powder of nano size was also there, but people perhaps would not have recognized the significance of the nanoparticles those days, but they were using it in medicine. Then we also have Buddhist contributions. Buddhism emphasized nirvana and did not make any novel contributions to understand the physical world except contributions to medicine. They continue to use the pre-Buddhist Brahmanical contributions, astronomy in the areas of astronomy, mathematics, pharmacy and nakshatras and other subjects to understand the world. Buddhism spread to different countries in Asia, and these ideas were transmitted to other countries as well. Again, the same book I referred to. The Pali canon, where most of the Buddhist texts were written in Pali language, and Pali canon, which is called the Thera, divided into 3 parts, 3 Pitakas. The corpus of material of the 3 divisions were consolidated after the death of the Buddha, Gautama, by the successive councils of Buddhist monks. Then we also have a rich tradition of contributions coming from Jaina literature. Jainism is another religion, major religion that India is home to. Jainism originated here. Jainism as a religion has strong affinities to Brahmanical traditions in many ways and produced secular knowledge about the world, apart from their contributions to improvement of Dravidian languages like Tamil, Telugu, Kannada in the south and Gujarati, Marwari and Hindi languages in the north. The Jains call their sacred literature as Siddhanta or Agamas. Canonical literature includes Angas, Upangas, Prakarnikas, Cheda Sutras and Mula Sutras. The Anga texts are 12 in number, and among these Sthananga and Bhagavati Sutras, they deal with mathematics, astronomy and enumerate different branches of mathematics. Contributions of Jaina literature, the Upangas are also in 12 in number. They deal with living and non-living beings, classification of living creatures and Jaina cosmography, geography and ethnography. The text Chandra Pragnapti deals with sun and the moon and recognizes 2 suns and 2 moons and 2 series of nakshatras in accordance with their cosmography. So, this is another variation that we see, that, as I said, one of the lectures, that one can conceptualize the world in different ways and plural ways of conceptualizing the world. Here we see Jainas trying to say that there are 2 suns and 2 moons and 2 series of nakshatras. Then Prakarnikas deal with anatomy, physiology and embryology, and also method of measurement of time, grammar, philosophy, polity and Kama Sutra and drama. So, they also had extensively contributed to this knowledge about mathematics, astronomy, philosophy and so on. And the next phase that we are going to move into is the exchange, the influence of Arabic Arabic and Persian civilizations, on the exchange that occurred between Arabic and Persian civilizations on one hand and Indian civilization on the other. The exchange ranged from astronomy, mathematics, aesthetics, particularly from Persian civilization. Charaka Samhita, the Indian treatise on medicine, was translated into Persian and was shared with Arabic scholars during the establishment of the Caliphate. There was a great deal of mutual learning that occurred among Persians, Arabic people and Indians. The Indian numerals, for example, went to Arabia and from there they travelled to Europe. Hence, the Europeans called the numerals as Arabic numerals. Similarly, Ptolemy's astronomy, which went from source Greece to Arabian region and from there it went to Europe as Almagest. The text name is Almagest. So, there was lots of exchange that was taking place. There was also exchange between Indian astronomers and Indian scholars who worked on astronomy and Greek astronomy. One of the Siddhanta texts in astronomy in India is known as Yavana Siddhanta. Another kind of a text that Siddhanta literature we find is Romaka Siddhanta. It means they must have really borrowed some ideas from Roman civilization. So, one of the most significant contributions that were made by Arabic scholars is by Abu Muhammad ibn Ahmad al-Biruni. Al-Biruni lived during 973 and 1048 AD. Al-Biruni, a Persian by birth and a Shiite, travelled to India during the campaigns of Muhammad Ghazni and covered northwestern India. He learned Sanskrit and wrote 20 books on India on a wide ranging subjects like Indian mathematics, astronomy, philosophical literature. He was very much keen. He learned Sankhya and Yoga philosophies and the Bhagavad Gita, geography, and perhaps he was the first foreign scholar who studied the Indian Puranas systematically. So, I think there was openness to learn, there was some kind of openness to share the knowledge with others during this period, and ideas travelled across countries, across continents. People, we can imagine what it meant to travel to, what it meant for Biruni to travel to India, and for example, what it meant for some people, Indians, to travel to other countries those days. They did not have aircrafts, they did not have fast trains. We can imagine how they moved from one place to another those days. Another important period in our ancient Indian history, ancient history of science, is the contributions that were made by a group of people who contributed to astronomy. While contributing to astronomy, they also worked out mathematics that was used in astronomical texts. Significant contributions of Aryabhatta I, Bhaskara I, Brahmagupta and Manjulacharya. These are very extremely important scientists, mathematicians, astronomers who contributed to astronomy. Siddhanta texts and astronomy are important sources of mathematics as astronomical texts got increasingly mathematized. Rules to solve different kind of problems in arithmetic, algebra, geometry and trigonometry were proposed during this period by this group of people. Aryabhatta I, in his work on Aryabhatiya, AD 476, he was born. Bhaskara I in Mahabhaskariya, around 600 AD. Brahmagupta's Brahmasputa Siddhanta, 598 AD, and Aryabhatta II in Mahasiddhanta, AD 950, and Bhaskara II, AD 1114 AD. Siddhanta Shiromani divided into 4 parts: the Leelavati on arithmetic, the Bija Ganita on algebra, Ganitadhyaya and Goladhyaya, the last 2 over on astronomy. These texts were brought in a lot of fresh ideas and solutions. Use of mathematics in astronomy led also to development of mathematics in some sense. Then I said when Islam came to India, there was an active exchange between Arabic scholars, Indian scholars, which actually has been going on even before the Islamic rule in our country. This was going on, as I said. Al-Biruni visited India and spent a lot of time trying to understand various contributions by Indian scholars in mathematics, astronomy and medicine and so on. And Islamic rulers in India brought in their own knowledge system, some of which went from India earlier, as I mentioned. That, so for example, the medical text, the Charaka Samhita, which went from India, was again brought back to India by these Islamic rulers. The Unani system of medicine was brought into India, which again is the contribution of the Islamic rulers. The medical practitioners also borrowed from Ayurveda texts. See, initially they also borrowed a lot from Ayurveda texts, as I mentioned. The decline in patronage affected Ayurveda to some extent during this period. I think if you look at the a long period of time in which several contributions were made by Indian scholars, see that already they were the abstract thinking was an important attribute of Indians, and they could develop mathematics, astronomy and medicine, and for example Panini's grammar, which became important today in the computer science, and one can see the seminal contributions made by these people in the country. And during Islam we have seen a new system of administration and taxation came into existence, and a new language of administration also was introduced. Arabic, maybe Persian and Arabic, more of Arabic was introduced. Islam contributed to changes in the social order by adding new groups to the social fabric. Those who came from Arabian region and those Indians who changed their religious affiliation due to various reasons. Islam interacted with Indian culture, for example, languages and traditions of music, and led to genres of music like Sufi music. Next we move into a British rule, about which we're going to discuss shortly. The British rule marks a fundamentally new era. The British rulers and their intellectuals portrayed Indians as those who had a past but had no history, right? Indians as those who had a past but no history. Wanted to create a new India subservient to the British, economically, politically and culturally, which they succeeded. The cultural change that was initiated by introducing English language as a medium of instruction by Macaulay in 1935, not 30, by removing the native language from education, links with intellectual traditions were cut. If a group loses its language, it loses its culture, as the language is the repository of culture. I think this has happened in our history, and one should really be aware of what all happened during the British rule. So in this lecture we are going to look at the kind of developments that occurred in science and technology in colonial India, especially during the British rule. This is again drawn from the book Subbarayappa Bose and Sen edited, concise history of science, concise history of science in India, right? Sorry, this mistake, I should correct it. On the basis of analysis of developments in science in India in the ancient period and medieval periods, the authors of the book observe Indian culture region occupied a distinct place in the entire global knowledge production of that period. A comparative analysis or study of Indian scientific thought with that of Europe shows that while Europe was passing through a dark ages from about 5th century to 11th century AD, India had her glory in the classical age and made contributions to mathematics, astronomy, iotrochemistry, metallurgy, medicine, and these contributions almost were made up to the 12th century AD. So that means already India was really producing advanced knowledge in these areas, and thereafter the creative endeavour showed decline due to traditional compulsions and political vicissitudes. Artisans and craftsmen who did outstanding pieces of work could not get training and education, and there was no interaction between men of science and artisans and craftsmen. There is not significant interaction, I would say, or there is very little interaction between men of science and artisans and craftsmen in the country. And for example, the political vicissitude was caused by the invasion by foreigners like Islamic coming in of the Islamic rule, and several dynasties of Muslims invaded the country and tried to establish their kingdoms, their rule, and ultimately we had to go through this Islamic rule from 1200 AD to almost 1773, dominated by initially during Renaissance period. Before about 16th century, European knowledge system dominated by theological knowledge based on faith and revelation underwent a radical transformation and new knowledge system based on empiricism or evidence. Francis Bacon, it should be 1156, there's a small mistake here, and reason and logic, René Descartes during the 16th century and middle of 17th century were the foundations for these two theories of knowledge, one based on empiricism, the other based on reason or logic, were laid by these two people, and the empiricist theory of knowledge and rationalist theory of knowledge have become extremely important foundations for modern science. You can observe basically which made every individual to realize that one can produce knowledge about the world by using sense organs and sense perceptions, which is empiricist theory of knowledge, and that one does not have to believe something because it is said by a person in authority. One can subject every claim to the scrutiny of reason or logic and decide for oneself, which is rationality. Followed by this, their scientific revolution was ushered in by Copernicus, who proposed an alternate hypothesis to the existing geocentric theory of universe. He said the geocentric theory of universe has been creating several problems, like we could not predict a regular a uniform calendar year, and people were making adjustments to this theory. So he said there is a need to change it, and he hypothesized that one should place sun in the center of the universe rather than earth in the center of the universe. This is heliocentric theory of universe, which means it's a different way of looking at the world, which is very radically different way of looking at the world. You see the world standing close to the sun, it looks very different. If you look at the world standing on earth, you will get another picture. These are two different paradigms, and they are incommensurable. Both are different world views. Then Galileo was the one who laid foundations for the analytical synthetic tradition. He said, he emphasized measurements. He said, whatever observation you make, you try to measure. He said, measure and measure, measure the difference and the difference of the difference. That was the kind of dictum that Galileo gave. That means everybody must measure all observation that makes. And Newton was the one who is responsible for the laws of motion, invent laws of motion, and also And on a political front and economic front, there were other kinds of revolutions that were taking place. French Revolution in the second half of the 18th century laid foundations for a new political society based on values of equality, fraternity and freedom. Industrial Revolution in the later half of the 18th century in England has transformed European societies and later the rest of the world in terms of consciousness about the world and also interaction with nature, to use natural resources for production of food, clothing, shelter and industrial artifacts. Now we see the British rule, the European Renaissance led to new thinking and it led to new way of looking at the world, it led to new way of interacting with nature and it led to emergence of new kinds of societies. All this had tremendous impact on the world, and India also, which was under colonial rule, experienced this kind of changes, the impact of these changes that were occurring in Europe. When the British rule was established since 1773 by the East India Company up to 1857 and later the Crown rule since 1858 through the India Act in 1858, Western science was introduced into India during this period in a phased manner from 1773 to 1947, the year in which India got its political independence. India was under British rule. So how does one look at this spread of Western science in India? George Basala, a scholar of history of science, said in his paper on the spread of Western science, he said, he was trying to talk about generally how Western science spread to other countries, other parts of the world. He said stage 1, Europeans come in direct contact with the new land and begin investigation of flora, fauna and mineral resources on the basis of their systematic training they received in their native countries or home countries. Botanical and geological explorations are made and the results are fed back to the centers of learning in their own countries. Stage 2, new institutions are established in the new land to widen the explorations and investigations along the lines of the institutions in their native countries, European countries. These institutions are headed by Europeans. Stage 3 is the scientific endeavors initiated by Europeans attract native intellectuals to pursue science, thus laying foundations for a modern science in the new land, which the governments then start supporting the scientific activity in this new land, which increasingly is maintained by the people belonging to that new land. This model has been criticized for equating all countries that became colonies. For example, India has made significant contributions to scientific knowledge, as we already seen earlier, and such a country is equated with other colonies which perhaps were much less in terms of which made much less kind of contributions to the advancement of knowledge in different disciplines. In fact, the British investigators of nature who came to India published about the rational and efficient agricultural practices in the Journal of the Royal Society of England, the Philosophical Transactions. So they also recognized those who came into India, started looking at what kind of agriculture that was going on, and they used to write about these agricultural practices, agricultural implements, and these are published in the Philosophical Transactions, which is Journal of the Royal Society of England. Another important work, Garcia de Horta's book titled Simples Drugs Materia Medica of India, was first published in Portuguese language in Goa in 1596. It was based on the information that Horta collected from the Vaids, that is medical practitioners of Ayurveda medical practitioners and Hakims who were practicing Unani medicine. Further, this work was used by Linnaeus in his work on taxonomy. So, however, the British intellectuals, some of whom were administrators, started writing about India. The Royal Asiatic Society of Bengal was founded on January 15, 1784 by Sir William Jones, a British lawyer and Orientalist, to encourage studies on Indian society and culture. So, let us start looking at how the East India Company started operating in India and how one East India Company, or that is British East India Company, gained ascendance compared to other East India Companies. The British East India Company was started in 1600 and it was given a charter by the British rulers to do trade. It set foot on India in 1608 at Surat. The United East India Company of Netherlands entered the Malabar coast before the British India Company. The French East India Company entered India in 1664. These companies basically came to India to do trade. Articles of trade were Indian manufactures, spices which were brought in, which were bought in exchange for gold and silver that the Europeans mined in Latin American countries like Mexico and traded it across the world, traded these metals across the world. At that time, most of the gold and silver produced in the world ended up in India according to one particular source. There was a lot of gold and silver was bought by Indians by selling their manufactured goods and the spices. The European naturalists, medical men, engineers and technical persons who accompanied the traders from the above countries introduced Western science in India. Jesuit missionaries from Portugal acted as the agents of Portuguese company trading in India, and they were active in politics. In the courts of Mughal rulers, they played an important role in spreading Western science. The Christian missionaries and colonial intellectuals associated with the Royal Asiatic Society of Bengal tended to assume that India had a past but no history. They started constructing a history of India with an Eurocentric worldview. They always placed Europe as superior to other countries, other societies in the world, and Europe was superior to all other societies, and they thought that it was white man's burden to civilize the native people in different parts of the world wherever they went to colonize these countries. Now, this is how they looked at the kind of countries they colonized, and as I said, India by that time produced enormous amount of literature in various disciplines and advanced made contributions to mathematics and astronomy, medicine, etc. But these were not seen by these people as something important. They said Europe is the one which is standard yardstick with which you measure every other country, every other society, and say that these are all inferior to European civilization. The objects of investigation for members of the Asiatic Society were flora and fauna, religions, customs, literature, anything that is unique to this part of the world. They also started examining or studying arithmetic, trigonometry, algebra, astronomy, medicine, and wide variety of subjects, including theatre, dance, etc., right? Several cultural activities of these countries were also studied by these people. The second thing, scientific institutions and their work in the 17th and 18th centuries. In the 18th century, commercial policies of the British encouraged the study of economically useful plants because they wanted to see how they can use the resources that India has for their own economic benefit. In the 18th century, commercial policies of the British encouraged the study of economically useful plants, minerals, and other natural products of India. Understanding the climate and geography of the country was important for the British military, which was trying to advance to different parts of the country to occupy these princely kingdoms. The Europeans were the investigators and Indians were the basically assistants to start with. Indians did not get science education and training till a long time. So, Europeans were heading these institutions, and they were the ones who produced knowledge in different areas, like for example, flora and fauna, understanding the minerals that are present here, climate, geography, etc. They were the ones who were heading these institutions and also producing knowledge. One more, Henrik van Reed taught Drakenstein, who lived during this period 1637 to 1692, studied a number of plants in Malabar coast with the help of European surgeons and Malabar medical practitioners. His work, Hortus Malabaricus, was published in Amsterdam during 16 1698 and 1703 in 12 volumes with 794 illustrations or plates. Carl Linnaeus, the Swedish botanist, used this work in classification of Indian plants in his Species Plantarum. The Royal Botanic Garden was established in Sibpur in 1787 to cultivate teak trees for the purpose of shipbuilding. Earlier they were importing teak from Burma. Robert Kidd, who developed the garden, introduced 300 species. The garden occupied an area of 300 acres. The attempt to survey the Indian landmass was attempted, and the first map of Hindustan was prepared by Rennell in 1783. Several strategically important regions were surveyed and maps were developed. Meteorological observations were made regularly by using appropriate instruments to record rainfall, wind direction, etc., which was useful for the sailors, astronomers and medical personnel. Madras Observatory was established in 1794 for promoting knowledge of astronomy, navigation and geography. If you look at the developments in science in the 19th century, the scope of scientific activity increased. They looked at several domains. They looked at developing basic disciplines like physics, chemistry, mathematics and so on. First, English education and modern subjects like physics, chemistry, biology and liberal arts were introduced. One of the most important changes that occurred in our country, which changed the culture of our country, was the Macaulay's decision, Macaulay's minute, 1835. He saw that his undertaking was a civilizing mission. This minute, 1835 minute of Macaulay said, we must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern. A class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals and intellect. This is one of the important landmarks in Indian history, especially colonial history, where the Macaulay's note treated Indians as wanted Indians to be interpreters between the English and the millions whom they ruled, and they have to be class of persons, Indian in blood, color, but English in taste, in opinions, morals and intellect. That is the beginning of removing our native languages in education and closing these schools which taught these languages. This shift meant removing Persian and Sanskrit languages from schools. This played an important role in changing education system in India. I mentioned earlier that the language of a particular culture or society is a repository of their culture. So if the language is removed, the culture is removed. If the language is lost, the culture is lost. So that's how we lost, actually our connections with our traditions during colonial period, and even now, even after independence, we were not able to establish our links with our traditional knowledge system, traditional kind of scholarship. So modern universities were established in the 1850s. For example, Bombay University, Madras University, Calcutta University, Allahabad and Lahore, they all came in the decade 1850s. And these were affiliating universities. They were giving degrees to those who studied in various colleges. The first railway line was laid in 1853 between Bombay and Thana, and of course later on railway lines were extended to other parts of the country. Basically, one argument that is being made all the time is that the railways were constructed by the British to basically to transport raw materials like cotton. Cotton became an extremely important industrial raw material for producing cotton cloths, which Britain exported to all parts of the world. Britain earlier specialized in production of woolen garments. Woolen garments, the market is limited, especially to temperate countries, so they could not export to other parts of the world. So they said they switched over to cotton production, cotton cloth production, and this cotton, because of this shift, they wanted a lot of cotton to be imported from other countries. India is one of the important sources. Of course, those days Pakistan was part of India, and a lot of cotton was imported from India for making cotton clothes. Another far-reaching change that occurred was in the revenue system. See, the British government introduced new land systems which is one is permanent settlement, which was introduced in 1793 by Cornwallis, and Mahalwari system and Rightwari system 1820 by Monroe. These changes led to oppression of peasants and high land taxes, and this impoverished peasantry and created landless workers. For the first time in Indian history, a clearly categorized group of people did not have land, who were called landless workers, were created during this period. And every time Rightwari system, it was each individual peasant was taxed, and every time the tax amount increased. The other, for example, permanent settlement system, there were intermediaries who were collecting tax from the farmers, and part of it was paid to the British government. And this was very, very exploitative, and peasants could not really pay so much tax. And one of the important ways of addressing this problem by the government was to throw the farmers out of the land if they failed to pay the tax. Next stage, as it were, is the Indian leadership in science. Indians educated English medium started occupying teaching and research positions in the academia. Ashutosh Mukherjee made significant contributions to mathematics at an young age, and he was also the architect of Calcutta University. He was the first vice chancellor of the university. Jagdish Chandra Bose contributed the first research paper in physics from India in 1895. His research was in the area of electric waves and their interaction with matter. He developed devices to generate waves of smaller lengths and to measure wavelengths. Prafulla Chandra Ray made systematic chemical analysis of Indian minerals to find out if you could find any element that could be added to the periodic table. Of the 19th century, people were really entering these portals of higher education and research, and also some of the scientific institutions like the surveys, like geological survey, and organizations which really were involved in surveying various aspects of country were also, Indians also started entering these organizations. The first generation Indian intellectuals also saw the significance of political independence to progress in science. They understood that the colonial rule placed constraints on development of science in India. They initiated attempts to build independent scientific research organizations without depending on the support of the colonial government. The first such attempt was establishing the Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science, which was built by raising donations from Indians in 1876 by Mahendralal Sarkar. He was instrumental in creating this institution. This is the institution where C.V. Raman worked to get his Nobel Prize. The intellectuals realized the need to develop nationalist science as a response to the colonial control. In the 20th century, the spirit of nationalism and the significance of political independence was realized by the scientific community, and they could visualize what kind of science should be done in independent India. During the interwar period, the idea of nationalist science grew stronger. The scientists debated as to the goals of scientific research in independent India. The debate between Homi Bhabha and Saha was significant. Homi Bhabha insisted that India should build finest theoretical institutes, and Saha felt that science should address the problems of India's masses. For example, he said the problems of Indian science are the problems of Indian masses. The debate between Gandhi and Nehru, Gandhi on the one hand trying to argue that mechanization would only lead to poverty, and he also was really, initially at least, was against mechanization, introducing industrial machinery, whereas Nehru said the future belongs to those who make friendship with science, and he also talked of scientific temper. He said scientific temper is applying scientific methods to understand things, and it goes beyond application of merely methods. It's going to contribute to humanism. So I think these were the debates that were initiated just during the early 20th century before independence, and before independence, actually during 1930s, people started debating on the question of science and technology in India. Several people said industrialization is the only method of achieving economic development, and people said that the scale of industry should also be decided, whether it is small scale or large scale industries should be established in India.